This is a virtual reading of Conspirators, To Each His Own Agenda by Matt Gupta.
Chapter 53. Lord Decimus's residence. The Legion supped and the attack began. The men had spent the morning moving the catapults forward so they could bombard the second wall, and had then assumed their formations with a newfound discipline that marked them as veterans. They had lined up in formations of 100 men in the city outside the gatehouse to the second wall. It was hard to find room for them to operate. The second gate wasn't meant for sieges, but the wall itself, as was the norm in the kingdom, was higher than the first. The defenders on the wall had readied a similar defense, but the wall was too high for the attackers to use their ladders. It took them a while to ready the ram. The route through the streets was mostly uphill, and it ran completely along the wall. So the ram was constantly under attack. The bombardment had been tearing chunks in the wall for nearly 2 hours, and the men's morale was broken. When the ram was breaking the gate down, many of the defenders broke formation and ran. The Ranger militia forces were already in good spirit by the time the ram reached the gate. The sounds of the people on the other side crying out the retreat sent their morale skyrocketing. It inspired them to do greater things, despite losing half of their men. Every blow of the ram was more devastating as the wood and iron began to splinter. Gilorn and Iorlem could hear the crashes and cries of the soldiers. "We don't have much time," Iorlem whispered. "As soon as those troops are done fighting, there will be nothing to stop them fucking all of us in the arse." Gilorn nodded. They had spent an hour riding to the north and found the entrance to the sewers exactly where Felthor said it would be. The northern point of the city had been captured, but had been left mostly undisturbed. While normal circumstances would allow the defenders to use this route as a means of outflanking their attackers, it was left forgotten, as the defenders were too focused on the main army to realize it. The Rangers with them had taken broad cutting swords to the iron grating and were cutting through the rusted metal. Before long, they were through. "Right, lads," Iorlem whispered, the noise of their sloshing footsteps louder than the battle. "Stick to the shadows and don't fall behind." "I've never seen a sea-ward princess," the most bearded ranger sneered. "I'm looking forward to some royal cunny." "She's not to be touched," Gilorn warned. "We treat her with all the respect and dignity that she deserves." "Fuck dignity," a pockmarked ranger retorted. "If I see a pair of tits in front of me, they're mine." "I don't think you made your choices particularly well," Iorlem grimaced. Gilorn raised an eyebrow in agreement. "Ah, well, too late now." They found the ladder to the street level. Iorlem ascended and readied to open the hatch. "Watch out for flying boulders, lads." They ran through the empty streets, rushing from building to building. When they reached the second wall, they began climbing onto the buildings with the agility expected in Dacian archers, and finally found a set of buildings that ran right up against the wall. The Rangers prepared themselves and then fired arrows to the wall above them. Each arrow was attached to a rope, and when they reached the top, they began climbing up the wall. They reached the summit of the wall and heaved themselves over it. They could see the entire battlefield from up there. Off in the distance, they could see the flames that were already consuming the city. "Okay," the bearded ranger grunted. "Where is this bitch at?" "There," Gilorn pointed with his bow, at a point 3 street blocks away from the edge of the fighting. "Fuck me," the third ranger whistled. "She must have some pretty precious cunt in between her legs if we're expected to risk that." "Fuck risk," Iorlem growled. "These are our orders. Obey them, or I'll throw you from the wall. When nobody voiced any further complaint, they set off again. They made their way down the wall, choosing to scale them with their ropes instead of risking the possibly guarded staircases. They made their way up a building and onto the rooftops. The streets were a maze. Iorlem had lost all sense of direction by the time they had passed the second street. Gilorn, on the other hand, had memorized the route on maps, and he had a good eye for direction. Before long, they reached the block and dropped down to the street below. One of the rangers missed the corner where Gilorn had taken cover and stupidly walked out into the streets where several guards were standing outside the entrance to Decimus's residence. Iorlem grabbed the man and pulled him back, just in time. The guards seemed to be looking the other way as they commented on the battle. Iorlem and Gilorn exchanged a nod, and they both aimed their bows around the corner. Gilorn was high and Iorlem low. The two guards outside were dragged along by the arrows and were pinned to the wooden posts of the doorframe. For a moment they waited, but when no one seemed to respond to it, the rangers moved up. "These aren't Citadel guards," Iorlem pointed out as they passed them. "Mercenaries in Ignatius's employ," Gilorn agreed. "I'm surprised they're still here. Falthor said they deserted." "They probably will." Iorlem brushed his nose. There was a great booming crash and a cheer that rang out across the city streets. "They've breached the gate. We don't have much time." They entered the building. The residence was big, but had narrow corridors. Narrow enough for them to be unable to use their bows. So they used their dirks and short swords. Iorlem had a skill for it, whistling to guards from around a corner and knifing a man in the neck. Before the next man could respond, he threw the knife into his head and then moved up to kill him in his stunned state. This, however, was where Gilorn's sense of direction came to an end. He did not know where Kellisto was. He stuck his head into every room, but there was no sign of her. "She's not here," the pockmarked one complained loudly. "Keep it down," Gilorn hushed frantically. "There may be more of them." "Fuck the quiet," the ranger retorted in a booming voice. Iorlem's knife came out through his mouth and he collapsed, his head falling onto the corner of a bench. "About time," Gilorn muttered. "I thought he'd never shut up." "Where is she?" Iorlem growled, spitting on the dead man's corpse and making a ward against evil. "I'll try upstairs." Gilorn looked up at the ceiling. Nobles like being able to look down on the people below them. "Go." Iorlem jerked his head. "I'll deal with the others." "Others?" The bearded ranger appeared around the corner. "What have you done?" he shouted. They could hear people moving in alert above them. "Go." Iorlem spun his blades around. "Find the girl, find the babe. I will join you soon." Gilorn didn't hesitate or acknowledge the other two men. He rushed past them and found the remaining men. He had never met them before, as they were Iorlem's friends, but he trusted Iorlem's judgment. His own choice of the bearded and pockmarked men had yielded in bad results. He told them to follow, and they did without question. The men waiting on the second floor knew they were coming and had already fortified themselves for their arrival, taking cover around corners and in doorways out of sight. The rangers carefully continued along the corridor, which was long enough they could at least use a bow straight ahead. One man had a sword and another had two knives in his fist, whilst he held his arrow. The mercenaries pounced. One ranger was cut down immediately, but his arrow took a man in the eye before he fell. The man with the sword struggled the most in the fighting. The corridor was too narrow for him to do more than stab and swing downwards, his strikes breaking the expensive vases and denting the brightly painted walls. The two rangers with Gilorn, who had their bows readied, stepped over their fallen brother and fired at the men on the far side of the corridor. One man, who seemed to have some experience in fighting bowmen, swung his sword in an upwards thrust and sent the arrow spiraling away. Gilorn marked him as his next target, firing off 3 arrows in rapid succession. The man sliced the first aside, ducked under the second, and caught the third in his free hand. Gilorn was impressed for a time, but the rush of battle put an end to his shock before it could take hold. He seized on his opportunity and fired another round of arrows at the man, only firing at a half-draw for speed. The other rangers moved to engage the other men, leaving Gilorn to fight the acrobatic mercenary. His ploy worked. He managed to shoot the man in the hand that held the arrow before he could drop it. The man let out a curse in his native language, more like a cough than a word, and tried to prise the arrow out of his wrist. Gilorn leapt off of a table and fired a shot downwards at the man. The man reacted, but too late, the arrow sinking into his chest and forcing him to his knees. Gilorn turned to look behind. The rangers were fighting the mercenaries hard. Another ranger had fallen, but Gilorn fired an arrow into the crowd and took one of the mercenaries from behind. The fight turned in that instant. One man tried to run from being outflanked and was cut down. Gilorn turned back to his man, who was coughing blood onto the expensive silver-threaded rug. He knocked another arrow to his bow and used it to push up the man's head. The man growled something through his bloodied mouth. Gilorn couldn't understand him, but he knew it wasn't kind, so he drew the arrow to the man's head, took a step back and fired, the arrow stopping in his skull as if it belonged there. The rangers were finishing the fighting, so he went on ahead, thinking it better to speak to Kellisto alone. He entered the largest room, which took most of the space of the upper floor. He entered slowly, his bow lowered. He didn't want to seem dangerous. It did not matter, though. A handmaiden dressed in a blue, somewhat revealing dress threw herself at him, knife in hand. He did not fight her, but simply pushed her aside. He quickly nocked an arrow and pointed it threateningly at her. "Stay," he ordered, as if to a dog. "You do not give orders in this house," a voice retorted behind him. Gilorn turned, instinct causing him to draw to his cheek. He found that he knew the voice as well as her face. "My Lady Kellisto," he greeted, removing his arrow and tucking it alongside his bow. He lowered his head slightly in a makeshift bow. "Who are you?" she demanded. "My father will have you castrated if you lay a hand on us." "Peace, my lady. I come on behalf of General Felthor and your brother, my Lord Julius." She lowered the metal rod used to stir fires. "You are the Kingslayer Ranger." "Aye," Gilorn nodded. "I have orders from General Felthor to escort you to the Citadel until your father conquers the city." "And why should I trust a man who murders his way into my home?" Kellisto demanded, as Rufus cooed in her arms. "You should not," Gilorn went to one knee. "But know that I owe allegiance to both General Felthor and your brother, Lord Julius, by the honor he bestowed on me when he knighted me and the debt I owe to Felthor. I will protect you." He unclipped the brooch on his jerkin and tossed it to her. She didn't make an effort to catch it, but it landed gently onto the bundled Rufus. "Get my cloak and my dagger," she demanded to the handmaid, with barely a glance at the brooch. "Wait for me, my lady." Gilorn stood back up. "I will check that all is clear." He returned to the corridor. The rangers had the last mercenary on his knees at sword point. "Where is your captain?" the rangers were demanding. The mercenary protested in the Sand People tongue. "He left before the siege. He was fucking every whore in the lower city when the siege began. He has not returned." He spat. "Good riddance." "My sentiments exactly," Iorlem agreed, from behind him, and he slit the man's throat, drenching him in even more blood than he already wore about him. "Do you have the princess?" "I." Gilorn looked around. "And the babe." "Let us go then." Iorlem jerked his head back. "We've lingered here too long." Gilorn called to Kellisto, and they left the residence and into the streets. As soon as they crossed the threshold, they heard a triumphant horn blast. "What is that?" a ranger started. "My father," Kellisto panted, her face alive with glee. "The army of Seaward has come." "We need to move," Gilorn said sharply. "The second wall is already breached. To the citadel." The journey was easy enough. The citadel mirrored the light from the flames, so they knew where to go. Before long, they were mounting the staircase to the citadel gardens. The journey up the stairs took longer than the journey from Decimus's residence, but eventually they made it to the top. Strangely, there were 4 wardens of the fountain court, standing guard over the fountain. They kept vigil over it, despite the battle. Gilorn suspected that if the battle came to this place, they would still stand vigil and only fight if the fountain was threatened. "Come," Kellisto confirmed his suspicions. "We have nothing to fear from these men." As they passed, the wardens inclined their heads in sync with each other. "Why do you remain?" she asked to them. "Our Lord Warden orders us, my lady," the closest one said. "Does the battle not frighten you?" Gilorn asked. "Fear is controllable," the warden responded, and that was the end of that. "We are taking shelter in the citadel," Kellisto informed them. "For the sake of the future prince of the realm, will you defend us?" "No," another warden said. "There is no threat to you here. We defend the fountain, nothing else." "Coward," Iorlem spat. "Come, before this wind blows the babe from your breast." "Only 2 men in this world have the right to comment on my breasts." Kellisto looked as if she'd slap him. However, the wind was proving Iorlem right. "You are not one of them." The rangers all exchanged laughs and entered the citadel. The door was manned by 2 citadel guardsmen, who nodded to them as they entered. Unlike most who entered the citadel, they did not inquire as to their business and simply pushed the doors open. As they were about to cross the threshold, they followed them in and closed the doors. The group advanced to the throne, crossing the long hall, their footsteps echoing around the stone walls. "Where shall we go?" Iorlem asked, too exhausted to comment on the room around them. "There is a food store following a maze of corridors," Gilorn pointed. "We can be well protected there." "I am a princess of Seaward, mother of the heir of House Steward. I will not hide like a peasant girl in a cupboard." "I have my orders." "And I am ordering you," Kellisto said sternly. "Bloody princesses," a voice spat from above them. "You think you rule the world." There was a long silence. There were no torches lit, so it took them time to locate the source of the noise. It was only when the citadel guards advanced, somewhat irritably, with torches that they saw the speaker. "Ignatius!" Kellisto gasped, gripping Rufus tightly to her chest. "I ordered you imprisoned," Ignatius shouted and leaned forward into the light. He was a wreck of the man he once was. In the past days and nights, he had aged almost 20 years. His once well-defined muscles now hung from him like the horrific wings of some grotesque creature through his torn clothes. His eyes were bloodshot, and one was rolling limply in his head. The bruise on his head had turned purple and black. "Caesar!" The citadel guards marched in front of Kellisto and crossed their spears in front of her, their points pointed towards Ignatius. "You are no longer in command, my lord," one of them growled, seemingly glad to have something to do. "You would wage war with me." Ignatius leapt to his feet. It wasn't an impressive move. He was shaking so badly, he fell down the stairs to the throne and thudded to the ground at their feet. Iorlem knocked an arrow and pointed it at Ignatius. Ignatius panted as he heaved himself up to look at them. His cloak, with the golden jewels dangling from it, seemed to be too heavy for him. No one made a move to help him. At that point, the doors to the side of the hall burst open, and a dozen mercenaries burst in. The fight wasn't long. The Citadel guardsmen took point, pushing Kellisto away from the fighting with the butt of their shafts. The Rangers all managed to fire an arrow off each, taking down a number of their foes before the fight began. The mercenaries were quite clearly drunk, and their armor was hanging off their shoulders loosely and haphazardly. The Citadel guards did most of the fighting, the Rangers falling back to cover Kellisto as she lay where she had been pushed. Rufus was crying over the clashing of swords and spear. It was clear who was going to win, and sure enough, the last mercenary fell. Ignatius had pulled himself into a sitting position and was glaring at Gilorn and Iorlem. Falthor will hang for this outrage. When I see his body thrown from the wall, I will see you punished in darkness for this heresy. Iorlem pulled out a knife and held it to Ignatius's neck. Then perhaps I should kill you now since I'm already doomed. The Citadel guards stepped forward, pointing their spears at Iorlem mere inches from his head. He barely noticed, and neither did Ignatius, until Gilorn put a hand on his shoulder. Iorlem, let him go. Our orders are complete. His death will not serve any purpose. Alistair will need him alive to parade through the city with his victory. He looked at Kellisto, as the remaining Rangers helped her up to sit in the chair at the bottom of the stairs. And there has been enough blood spilled in front of an innocent. Iorlem exhaled irritably and relented his grip on his knife. He had cut Ignatius's neck, but not deeply. Ignatius scrambled away as fast as he could. "Leave the cloak," Iorlem called out loudly. "I like that cloak." Ignatius looked like he would refuse, so the Rangers abandoned their place next to Kellisto and tore it off him. Ignatius stormed away, limping slightly, and through a side door. "Keep him under watch," Gilorn said to the Citadel guards, "if you deem it worthy." The Citadel guards looked at each other, then back to Gilorn. "He cannot escape this city, Kingslayer," they responded. "We would guard the heart of the Citadel." And they took positions on the corners of the throne stairs. Gilorn sighed. "Fuck me," Iorlem grunted. "This thing weighs more than my horse." He had donned the cloak of the stewards. "Careful," Gilorn warned. "Wearing that cloak makes you the dictator of the city, not a popular position at the moment." "I kind of like the sound of that." Iorlem looked dreamily up at the throne. "Lord Iorlem, son of some man." The Rangers all laughed and watched him climb the stairs to throw himself into the throne. They gave him a moment's silence to contemplate his new position. "You know, I always wondered why Ignatius was such a miserable cunt. Now I know." Gilorn gave him a blank look. "This chair is more uncomfortable than that whore I accidentally fucked up the arse when I became a man."